I am going to show you how at least Yahweh, not kurios or Lord or something like that, was almost certainly written in the original New Testament text, beginning with the synoptics and John. So any believer that would like to fulfill Joel 2:32 as happened in Acts chapter 2 can clearly understand the New Testament in light of this important biblical teaching of the name of the Father in the New Testament. This segment is especially important for any Christian or Messianic believer or Jewish believer in the New Testament, and I want you to give yourself 15 uninterrupted minutes now. For those of you who may already know, the name of the Almighty of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is Yahweh, and with the correct vowels, Yot, Patak, He, Silent Schwa, Wa, Sigol, He. Now, this name is ubiquitous in the Old Testament, occurring over 6,800 times, and is so important that the third commandment specifically says, well, don't blaspheme it or use it inappropriately. But as I showed in the beginning of this series, when it comes to the New Testament, we find a different language and at the same time no Yahweh to be found, but only the Greek terms kurios and theos, treated as if Yahweh itself was there, but which were also used in paganism and pagan worship of Zeus, Isis, Serapis, etc. Bringing us to another problem we will discuss in the next part 3. 2 reasons why this absence is strange. 1, even in quotations of Old Testament passages where Yahweh is found, in the New Testament, they're not. And 2, when direct discourse is used reminiscent of the Old Testament phrases such as angel of Yahweh, seen in Luke 1 verse 11, for example, again Yahweh is not found. This has of course raised eyebrows, but only notably in the cautious theory of George Howard from 1977 on. I, of course, began research on something more mysterious, like the study of the Messiah's name, but that overlapped with the name of the Father. But when I went back to the earliest New Testament manuscripts, I found something remarkable. But before I get into this, a note on relevance. For any believer in the Messiah of the New Testament, this is relevant for many reasons, but I will give you just 4. First is the injunction in Deuteronomy 4:2 that says, "You shall not add to the word that I command you, and do not take away from it, so as to keep the commandments of Yahweh, your Elohim, that I command you." So we cannot take away from the word. And you remember Matthew 5:17-20 in the New Testament. But 2, we cannot teach for his fear the doctrines or precepts of men, from Isaiah 29:13, and man's traditions are seen reprimanded in Matthew 15, quoting this very text from Isaiah. 3, certain prophecies require the name Yahweh to be fulfilled, such as Joel 2:32, which was directly quoted by Peter as being fulfilled then in Acts chapter 2. Read both passages very carefully. And 4, in the future, at the end of the age, the saints victorious over the beast will sing Yahweh's name in song in Revelation 15:3. So any Christian or Messianic believer or even Jewish believer in the New Testament would certainly find these answers critical to at least confirm or debunk. So what remarkable thing is there in the earliest New Testament manuscripts that I can present? There is a unique, previously unexplained New Testament manuscript feature called nomina sacra, Latin for sacred names. Scholars have tried to understand. Let me explain it. Today in your English New Testament, you have Lord or God in English, sometimes reflecting Yahweh and Elohim in the quoted Old Testament passages here, but mostly in the text now referring to the titles used for the Son. I am not going to discuss the underlying spoken Hebrew terms here, but some of you may already know them. But note that the Lord or God in your English Bible is reflecting the Greek texts kurios and theos. Now, these are not biblical sacred names, but what is amazing is that when you go back to all of the very earliest Greek manuscripts our Bibles came from, copied or preserved outside of Jewish scribal circles, all the places where we now see written kurios, theos, Jesus, and Christos appear strangely as abbreviations and never spelled out fully, but looks like this with the first letter and the last letter of that name with a stroke above it, as here. But the practice is not found in the Old Testament Greek called the Septuagint, copies of scripture preserved by the Jewish scribes. And the Greek diaspora Jews use the word theos, sometimes mixing it with pagan contexts like Zeus, Ge, Helios, but never abbreviating it the way we find it. So Ludwig Traub's suggestion, the first scholar to write about this prominently, that it came from Hellenistic Jews is not valid. But many others since have thought it is related to the Jewish tradition to not say the name Yahweh, a tradition existing even to this very day. In other words, clearly Matthew or an early apostle did not write these abbreviations down. So George Howard, another scholar to take it up in modern times, took it a step further and went back to before New Testament times to the earliest Jewish Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible called the Septuagint, where one finds another remarkable thing, that these early Septuagint copies do not even have kurios at all, but only a Hebrew Yahweh within the very page of the Greek text itself, but along with a Greek theos. Howard suggested the name should also have been found in the New Testament quotes from the Old Testament. He importantly said that, and I quote, "Thus somewhere around the beginning of the 2nd century, the use of the surrogates must have crowded out the tetragram in both testaments." But is such changes possible? Of course it is. And Howard gives examples in manuscripts of Philo where it occurred. The test for you now is, if you found that your New Testament Bible had Yahweh and Elohim, would you start praying to Yahweh in the name of his Messiah today? An important question, no doubt. But there is more. There is a body of literature in Judaism called the Talmud that mentions the earliest believers, and some statements are very interesting. So what does the Talmud say about the New Testament and sacred names? Well, remember the polemic against the Nazarenes or earliest believers was strong in the Talmud, so any casual statements about them carry some weight. Now, the earliest legal part of the Talmud, called Mishnah, was compiled by Judah the Prince about the year 220. But there is an early passage in a work called the Tosefta, an early legal companion to the Mishnah, Tosefta Shabbat 13.5, that says this: "The Gilyonim, or evangels, and the books of Minim, one does not save them on Shabbat, but they are burned in their place, they and their askarot, or sacred names." Rabbi Jose the Galilean said, "In the week, one cuts out the askarot, hides them, and burns the rest." Rabbi Tarfon said, "May I bury my sons, O I swear, if, as they come into my hand, I would not burn them and their askarot, or sacred names." The context here is that the books that have sacred names, called askarot, are saved on Shabbat from a fire, but books of Minim or Nazarenes are not, although they do have sacred names. Well, what are the sacred names that they're referring to here? From clues in the Talmud itself, we know that askarot mean mainly Yahweh, but some Talmudic teachers also saw Elohim in this term. And remember, not only Yahweh, but also Elohim did receive special treatment when written in Paleo-Hebrew font, rather than the regular Hebrew font in writings of the ancient Qumran Jewish community. So it was treated similarly to Yahweh. Our problem now really is that all our current New Testament texts do not have any Hebrew sacred name or title at all. Neither Yahweh, Elohim, or Adonai, but only our kurios so-called nomina sacra. Well, did others like the Qumran community use a word that could be seen behind the kurios Greek title in the New Testament? Let's look at the Qumran community. Generally, Jewish scribes such as at Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, avoided even writing Yahweh, such as in the documents of the Yachad, or community as it is called. The documents are CD, 1QS, and 4QMMT, where they carefully substituted the L or certain pronouns for Yahweh. But in the New Testament, we see the opposite, with the nomina sacra in place of Yahweh. For example, in the book of John, whose writings are often compared to the Qumran community, we find the statement in chapter 12, verse 13. And I quote, "They took the branches of the date palms and went out to meet him and cried, saying, Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of Yahweh and the King of Israel." In classic Old Testament language. And in Acts, we find Luke writing in chapter 4, verse 29, "And now, Yahweh, look upon their threats and give to your servants to speak your word with much boldness." We never see this in either the Qumran documents or in the Talmud, where we see the phrase Kodesh Baruch Hu, or the Holy One, blessed is he, or simply a hey in the scriptural quotations of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. So there you have it. The earliest believers fulfilled the Old Testament prophecies by praising the Father in the name of his Son, where in this name there is also another surprise in this series. I'm Keon Sampson.